Morris, thank you for that very generous introduction. I don't deserve it. I also want to thank Taylor Ball and the other students who nominated me and supported my nomination. And as well, I would like to thank the Associate Arts and Humanities Dean Nora Chapman and Vice Provost Dennis Neff on the committee for choosing me. I very much greatly appreciate that. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank Brianne Skeen, who has really done an amazing job with this whole series. And Matt and Eric for the technical support. Very much appreciate that. I also want to thank my other Fresno State faculty. This is an extraordinary place to work. I've worked at several colleges and universities. I had a career as a community college professor. So I've seen, a few things across the country and various places. And I tell you, this is a marvelous place to work, really amazing. Humane folks with a mission, and I'm just honored to be a part of it. I also want to acknowledge Professor Joy Godo and Professor Matthew Gendian, with whom I'm honored to share this stage in the 5th year of this series. And finally, let me also say I want to thank my wife, Pam. Part of the, really all of the impetus for this discussion tonight has come from a 20-year running argument I've had with Pam about Bob Dylan. I'm sure everybody's had that experience, right? So thanks, honey. And I'd also like to thank my daughter, Iris, for helping me put together this PowerPoint presentation tonight. So thanks very much for that. Bob Dylan. Well, I've spoken to a number of my colleagues and friends about it, and the reactions have been very interesting. Some folks have said, Bob Dylan, oh yeah, it's about time. Got that Nobel Prize, my goodness, about time. I've also heard some colleagues of mine say, what were they thinking, One colleague said that Bob Dylan was far too casually elusive to be a poet. So I thought that's kind of an interesting comment. I actually like that comment, casually elusive. It's been polite astonishment from many folks. But I think that we can all agree that Dylan's work has impacted many people over the years. You probably would go about any place in this country and say the name Bob Dylan, and people would say, Bob Dylan, yeah, I've heard Bob Dylan's music. There have been thousands of books published about Bob Dylan. He's been the subject of academic literary conferences, the first being at Stanford in the early 90s. He has won how many Grammys? And in fact, he just won a Grammy this year after having won the Nobel Prize. I wonder how that would feel. It's like, oh, another Grammy? So what, After you win that Nobel Prize. That was a Grammy for Best Historical Album. So there's some of you in the audience tonight are probably, sort of astonished, as I am in a way, thinking of Bob Dylan as a Best Historical Album. Bob Dylan, yeah. He also won in 2008, many of you know, he won a Pulitzer Prize, a special category Pulitzer Prize. So many of you may have also seen Martin Scorsese's film, No Direction Home. Brilliant film on the life of Bob Dylan, just completely brilliant. He was asked in the 60s, and he's been asked many times over the years, do you think of yourself primarily as a songwriter or a singer or as a poet? At one point he said, I think of myself mostly as a song and dance man. So he has always been very, very reluctant to assume the mantle of spokesperson for anything, or poet, or anything like this. He really is just somebody who has, for years and years and years, done exactly what he wanted to do. Had a relationship with his art, and found a way to and this is going to be the key thing tonight, right? All the music, we're going to be here for 50 minutes or so. We can't really sort of cover everything. So what I've done is I'm sort of focused on one particular thing, tone. I'll be talking more with you about that later. Tone when it comes to Bob Dylan and his connection to the audience, and tone as well to the American Beat writers. Okay? So more on that. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, though. Why not? Let's talk a little bit here about the Nobel. As many of you know, Alfred Nobel was the inventor of dynamite and blasting caps. He owned at one point 90 armaments factories. In 1888, his brother died in France. And a newspaper mistakenly wrote an obituary of Alfred. And the title of it was Le Marchand de la Mort est mort. The Merchant of Death is dead. So that prompted Alfred Nobel to sort of re-examine his life. And he decided that he was going to leave his fortune to worthy endeavors. Some people have asked me, well, how come, why didn't they give Bob Dylan the Nobel Prize in Music? Well, the reason they didn't is because there is no Nobel Prize in music. These are the 5 original Nobel Prizes here. So, and in fact, the United States has been pretty well represented. These are the American winners of the Nobel Prize. We've got a couple expats here. Joseph Brodsky, born in Russia, singer, born in Poland. I think even Saul Bellow, I believe, was born in Canada, if I'm not mistaken. But nevertheless, these are folks who came to the United States and lived in the United States and made their living in the United States and became U.S. citizens. So we go all the way back to Sinclair Lewis in 1930, and then Toni Morrison in 1993. Toni Morrison, one little sort of thing. Toni Morrison and I grew up in the same town, Lorain, Ohio. Her father worked at the mill as well as mine did, the steel mill. We lived probably less than a mile from each other. Of course, I never knew her, obviously, in those days. But yeah, I was so totally delighted when she won that prize. Believe me. Well, you might want to ask yourself, and you probably have, how do they go about choosing a Nobel Prize winner? So I'm going to talk about that for you very briefly. The first person to win a Nobel Prize, 1901, was Sully Prudhomme, and Parisian writer. His big poem was La Vase Brisée, the broken vase. And really, I just read it the other day because I just had to see it. A young woman with a fan fanning herself accidentally breaks a vase or vase. And his poem runs from that. Anybody know who the youngest person ever to win a Nobel Prize? I'm going to help you out. Rudyard Kipling, at the age of 42, was the youngest person to win the Nobel Prize. Just some interesting things. So, the Swedish Academy is responsible for the Nobel Prize. If you really don't like the fact that Bob Dylan won it this year, this is the guy you write to right here. You can let this person know that you are unhappy. Conversely, if you're happy with it, you can also send him a letter and say, hey, great job. Who's eligible to win a Nobel Prize? That's kind of an interesting question, right? Well, the candidates are those nominated by qualified persons. I'm going to talk about that C below in just a moment. So basically, any college and university professor in the world is eligible to nominate somebody for a Nobel Prize. Kind of interesting. The ones that the committees seriously consider, I'm sure, are the ones that are invited. The committee actually invites people. Former Nobel laureates also nominate people. But, regular Joes like us can nominate it. And in fact, I was involved for many years. Connie Hale was involved for many years. Chris Buckley was involved for many years in trying to get a Nobel Prize for Philip Levine, our very own Philip Levine. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But other persons who are qualified but have not received invitations may also submit nominations, which I guess we fell into that category. But then again, no one can nominate him or herself. Now, we may ask ourselves, holy cow, what went on? What were they thinking, with the Nobel Committee when they gave this prize to Bob Dylan? Well, most of us in this room today won't be alive in 50 years because those proceedings are sealed, legally sealed for 50 years. So we really won't know. Some of you may make it, and I hope you do. There were some, 1966, the records were recently released, and something very interesting came about here. As you can see, Auden, Beckett, and Graham Greene were among those nominated. The nominating committee recommended Yasunari Kawabata, but the Academy did not follow that recommendation. And instead, this is the big controversy now, right, 50 years after the fact, the prize was given to Shmuel Yosef Agnon and Nellie Sachs. It's a Hebrew, wrote primarily in Hebrew, novelist, and both wrote about Jewish issues. Kawabata did not have to be unhappy for too long because he won in 1968. And Beckett won the year after that in 69. Auden and Green never received it. Well, believe me, they've received a lot of other honors, so I'm sure they weren't too sad about it. Now, it's interesting to note that in the wording of the prize, it didn't say, we're giving this prize to Bob Dylan because, hey, he's a great poet. They were much more diplomatic about that. They explained it in these terms. They gave him the prize in Lit for having created new poetic expression within the great American song tradition. So I'm just delighted by the way that they phrased that. In other words, who can get angry with that? I mean, it's something for the songwriters. There's something as well for the poets. At Dr. Jindian's diversity talk last week, he posed two very important questions. Who am I and who are you? And then a third question, which is the resolution of the two, who are we together? Carson McCullers had a wonderful phrase for that in The Member of the Wedding. She called it the we of me. The we of me, how we find connections, how we understand each other. Well, of course, literature in general is that's what it's all about. I like the fact that it's a great college to work for. Dean Saul Jimenez Sandoval emphasizes the connection between people as one of the primary responsibilities of the arts. I mean, it just makes sense, right? So here's what I'm going to be talking about tonight, basically, is tone. In writing, this is called tone. And tone is the artist's or the writer's relationship to the subject. Okay? The poet W.S. Merwin described the absence of tone as being lost in a world of your own references. Who wants that? Who wants that, So it just really makes our job by hour. I mean, people who write and teach, and people who are interested in a civil society, a civil and just society. It makes it all the more important for us to work hard. So the word tone means different things to different professions and different people, right? I mean, if you're talking about athletes, there's such a thing as muscle tone. Right? Muscle tone, yeah. Painters have tone in color, right? Red is a warmer tone than blue. Blue is much cooler. Musicians, and I don't pretend to know much about musicians, but I'll get to that in a bit, right? Musicians have a somewhat different thing going on, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But let me skip to poets and lyricists, okay? Poets use language and rhythm to establish tone. And there are two main modes of poetry, the lyric and the narrative, right? The lyric relies on juxtaposition to move the action forward. In other words, you have an image, you have a description, you take one thing, you put it here, you immediately compare it to something else. The resolution of those two gives you something else, a third thing. You bring something else. The problem with this is, where do you go? How do you move forward, right? That's what makes the lyric one of the more difficult forms. The narrative, on the other hand, it relies on chronology, from Chronos, right, the father of time in the Western tradition. First this thing happens, and then that thing happens, and then this thing happens, and then roll the end credits, kind of thing. But naturally, narrative can be manipulated. And I've given you a couple examples up here. So my students years ago used to know these references. When I would say Lawrence of Arabia, there would be somebody that would know that, Lawrence of Arabia, yeah, I remember that. Academy Award winner, 1962, sure. Or Chariots of Fire more recently. Oh, sure, Chariots of Fire. You know, the great athlete movie, right? You know, 1981, Academy Award winner. That's rare. But I'll tell you where it does happen, and it never fails. In the Smith camp classes, there's always somebody who knows these movies. So, yeah, great experience teaching with Smith campers, man. Thank you for that. You'll remember with these two movies that they begin with funerals. They begin with the funeral of the protagonist. So this is an example where narrative is flipped on its ear, right? So there are ways of dealing with narrative that are, and many people will say, you've heard this said before, right? Oh, the movie was lyrical, or oh, that's lyrical prose. I mean, that's part of, I think, what's meant by that. Another interesting thing, if we're going to talk about poetry and prose, is that poetry is a vertical form, whereas prose is a horizontal form. Now, what do I mean by that, right? So I'm not going to get all crazy touchy-feely with this, right? But let me just say, when you're reading a poem, the power of the poem moves down the page, right? It's an accretion of power, and it goes down the page. When you're reading prose, it's, in English at least, it's left to right. And you're just reading left to right, The page is only so big, so you have to cut it off somewhere and bring it back down to the left margin to keep going. If it weren't, you could have a prose that went to the moon, just one long line, around the equator, Yeah. That's a key difference. It's a real key difference in perception. So the word lyric comes from the Greek lyre, and basically it means song and recitation. If I'm wrong about that, Nora, please don't correct me. So some primarily narrative forms would be, say, for example, the ballad, the epic, and the fable. And I say primarily because, these things can be shifted. You can do a longer lyrical form or shorter narrative form. There's all kinds of talk these days about flash fiction or prose poetry, right? So, I think that's a healthy discussion to have. I'm glad we're having that discussion in academia, frankly. The very fact that we're here talking about Bob Dylan as poet is a songwriter and poet is testament to that. That we've broadened our horizons, so to speak. The Swedish Academy is broadened their horizons, right? Dylan is the only songwriter, pure songwriter, to have ever won the Nobel Prize. So to me, rather than saying the Nobel Prize Committee saying, oh, Dylan, poet, they're really proclaiming something else. They're proclaiming that the very definition of literature is expanded. Oh, I think that's brilliant. These are primarily lyrical forms here: haiku, sonnet, ode, elegy. I'm going to give you some examples of sonnets later. Jack Kerouac reading some of his sonnets. Some of his haiku. Okay? Now here's where it gets... Okay, my wife is saying I need to move along. Okay? So in addition to language and rhythm, right, songwriters and lyricists have an additional way of establishing tone that's ordinarily unavailable, right, to the poet, and it's pitch. Now, did I come up with this on my own? No. I went to the music department and I talked to my colleague, Corey Whitehead, and he generously spoke a long time with me about this subject because I wanted to try to understand this in my mind. Melody is derived from speech and pitch, all right? So poets, we just have speech. We have the rhythm, right? But we don't have pitch. In fact, Dylan, in his memoirs, The Chronicles, which is a terrific read, by the way, describes how the lyrics of his songs, he calls them dance partners to rhythm, tempo, and melody. Yeah, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? I think so. And then I often ask this question: what's the opposite of poetry? You guys somebody want to throw out an answer? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Some of you may have had my class before, may remember this. You may not. It's okay, either way. There's no wrong answer. I'll repeat your answer since there's not a mic on the crowd, please. Yeah, see, he's got me already. Of course, there's no wrong answer, but I like to think propaganda would be the opposite of poetry. Now, I would ask you why. Do you remember why? Yeah, I think he hit it right on the money there. Propaganda is interested about making large groups of people do exactly what somebody wants based on some ideology. Poetry really is all about the individual. What do you need? What's important for you? How are you going to be happy waking up in the morning? How are you going to be a better, kinder person? Right? So I think propaganda is, and there are many other things as well, the opposite of poetry. I would also say, as a corollary to propaganda, advertising. You got to watch advertising. Advertising is in a sense often like military training. In other words, they have to break you down. You're not good enough the way you are. You need product X in order to do whatever, right? Military training is very similar in that respect. I would say that's also the opposite of poetry. Military training is you have to get a large number of people together. You have to make them think as one, and they're not the brain of that. You know what I mean? There's somebody giving them the orders to do what they need to do. This is going to tie in later on with something else that we're going to talk about. So, there's that. Let's move on to the next phase of the operation. The American Beat movement, a really vibrant, sort of very indigenous American art form, the Beat movement, okay? It came out of post-World War II disillusion. I mean, there was science, right? We had science. Everybody's going to live better by science, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what happened? We had, 52 million people killed in the Second World War, and then as a kind of denouement to all of that, we had the atomic bomb, boom. We could all be destroyed in a wink of an eye. Well, people were like, oh my God, what's the point, right? What's the point? And of course, the Red Scare, Joseph McCarthy and the Red Scare. Dave Von Ronk said that McCarthyism put the folk music movement back at least 10 years. Because the folk artists like Pete Seeger, for example, like Cisco Houston, for example, were considered communist. And they were blacklisted, so they couldn't get gigs, they couldn't get their music published. It was really a drag, right? So this was all happening now. We also had a rise in Eastern philosophies and religion, right? Zen Buddhism came to the forefront. I don't know if you've done this, you can check it out online. Bob Dylan is quite a fine painter. And what does he paint? Zen Buddhist patriarchs. Now, who would have thought to specialize in painting Zen Buddhist patriarchs, right? Jazz became very important, particularly earlier on, bebop, which later on was replaced by rock and roll. People like Charlie Parker became absolute idols to the beat writers. George Shearing, Dizzy Gillespie, these were all very, very important to them. And drugs. Especially marijuana, which later was replaced in the 60s by LSD, and unfortunately, too, heroin, This played a large role. One of the reasons it played a large role was because there were so many people who were maimed and injured in the war and became hooked on morphine. So, that was a very, very sad and tragic, among many, chapter in history. Youth and nonconformity became very, very to the forefront. Dylan, so many times, if you watch this film, No Direction Home, he just lays into people over the age of 30, And I wonder how he must feel about that now, because he was born in 1941. So, the power of youth, the power of nonconformity. Interestingly enough, you sort of see that a resurgence of that now, which I think is a healthy thing. And then finally, I just wanted to add influence on the Beats, television. By 1950, when the Korean War started, there were 8 million television sets in the United States. Anybody want to venture a guess as to how many television sets there are in the United States now? I don't know either, but a whole lot more than 8 million. I guarantee you that. You can, I always tell my daughter, double check me on Google. Go ahead. So at Allen Ginsberg's long poem Howl, of course, was seized, and there was a very famous obscenity trial on this. And Lawrence Ferlinghetti, owner of City Lights and publisher of Howl, said this about the decade of the 50s, basically. It is not the poet, but what he observes, which is revealed as obscene. the sad wastes of the mechanized world, lost among atom bombs and insane nationalisms. And Mesro, really one of my favorite writers, Mesro, wrote a terrific book in 1940, published in 1946, called Really the Blues. Things went from bad to worse and kept right on traveling. I was dead beat, troubled by the shorts. Not penny one did I have. And I prowled around town in the only suit I had to my name, a beat-up old tuxedo with holes in the pants. And that's one of the earliest uses of beat, and the word beat, to describe what later became the beat movement in literature. And of course, it spread. The influence went far and beyond that, right? The whole beatnik culture. And many people, this is why they loved Dylan at one point so much. He refused that commercialization. The whole beatnik phenomenon was commercialized. I mean, later on, you got like Leonard Nimoy beatnik. You know what I mean? So that was a real issue for people. So they're down in now this is where Dylan starts, okay? So Dylan reads On the Road. It changes his life. And then Dylan gets a copy of Bound for Glory, right? Woody Guthrie is Dylan's true soulmate and idol. And he said at one point that he made a choice. He said he had to go the Bound for Glory route. So he went more toward folk music, right? As opposed to quote-unquote literary endeavor. So we've had some discussion about this now, and those of you who teach and those of you who are students, what should we do now after having a conversation like this? What's next? What am I supposed to do for you? What am I supposed to give you? Say it with conviction. Specific examples, thank you, my friend. Specific examples, that's exactly right. So I've got previews of coming attractions here for you. We're going to hear the whole song, Masters of War by Bob Dylan. All right? Many of you younger folks the Eddie Vedder version, more familiar with that, the Pearl Jam guy who did a cover of this song. Many people have done a cover of this song. I first heard it when I was in the army in Germany, actually. I bought a Pete Seeger record, and Pete Seeger was playing in Tokyo, and between verses, it was translated into Japanese, which was an amazing, I've never been able to find it on CD. I have an old 33 and a third LP of this, which I really cherish. And it just reminds me that Rolling Stone magazine periodically come out with their 100 most influential composers. Who is always at the top of the list? Yes, it is Bob Dylan. Yes. And Bob Dylan is also, people have estimated, now how they do this, I don't know, but they've estimated that his songs have been covered more often than any other songwriter, covered by other musicians and singers. That's kind of interesting, I think. And then, here are our beats, right? So we're going to think of Bob Dylan, and then we're going to think about our beats. And these are recordings of the actual folks reading these pieces. Bang Bang Outishly, Amira Baraka, born Leroy Jones. This piece anyway. Jack Kerouac is going to read a few American haikus. I got a few things to say about that. Diane Primo will read April Fool birthday poem for Grandpa, and then Allen Ginsberg will do the first part of his poem, America. I had to cut him a little bit short, and as well, I edited back. Actually, Eric did. Thank you, Eric. Edited back those two pieces for the sake of our time. So, if all goes according to plan, I'm going to press this clicker. The lyrics of the song. Now, let me just preface this by saying. It's important to preface this by, I forgot to mention the movie Beet Girl. 1961, if you haven't seen it, it's, in fact, the whole movie is on YouTube. Beet Girl, you'll love it. You believe me when I say that you will love it. Right, so what I've done is, I'm going to show you the lyrics. So you'll see the words in the lyrics, right? Now, the Dylan piece comes out of his literary Bob Dylan lyrics. And these are the collected lyrics from 1962 to 2001. So when you see this first version on here, as you hear him sing it, this will look very much like what you expect a poem to look like, right? You've got eight-line stanzas or verses. You've got a rhyming pattern at the end. You also have, it's written in syllabics. So in other words, it's about roughly six syllables a line. You'll see this and you'll recognize this as, as poetry, okay? So we'll listen to him sing it. There it is. Then I'm going to show you right after that what that song looked like when it was originally published for the first time in January of 1963 in a little magazine called Broadside out of New York. Okay? And I think is he a poet? Is he a songwriter? Again, ultimately, that's sort of the least interesting question, I suppose, of the night. But it's not an unimportant question. And I would say that it depends on how you see it, on how you see the work on the page. Okay? Yeah, right. Pam, move, she says. Okay. Bootleg. You hear the door. Well, so when you think about this in terms of tone, right? How might you describe this tone? Right? Angry, uh, condemning, almost didactic. It's a very interesting tone. And the fact that it captured the nation at that time. This was about the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is about the time that Vietnam is, just sort of starting to pop up on the national radar. A few more advisors here, a few more advisors there. And people were, they didn't want to buy into that scene, And this song really captured that. It really did. So I think, to me, one of the great things about Dylan was the fact that he did establish his tone so completely with people, with the audience. Just amazing, actually, quite astonishing. So that's a very literary, as I mentioned. You've got roughly 6 syllables per line. It's syllabic, and you've got your sort of end rhymes at the end of the syllables or verses, however you want to call it, and you can recognize this as a poem without a doubt. Now, this is what it looked like when it was first published. Okay, this is from Broadside Magazine, February, I'm sorry, I said January earlier, February 63. No zip code, right? So that looks right. And it's illustrated by Susie Rotolo, who was his girlfriend at the time. So here we have, obviously, a guy with carving up the world, knife and a fork, and looking here at this young family. Down here we have a baby carriage with a gun on the side and tank tracks, right? And I believe that's a flower that's sort of coming up out of there, all right? So here we have the music then. So here we have it, and those of you who read music would know about it. And the stanzas then look like this. So you can see it looks very different when it's sort of scored for music. A kind of interesting aside about this song was, this is based on an English ballad called Nuttimon Town. And the Kentucky folklorist and folk singer Jeannie Ritchie had copyrighted an arrangement of this song. So all the texts I've looked at says unbeknownst to Bob Dylan. So she heard about this and she sued him. And he settled this for, in 1963 dollars, $5,000 to settle that. That's kind of an interesting aside about this song. Those musicians stick together, right? All right, and then this was the rest of it as it looked like, when it was first published as the lyrics to the song, and then it looks less demonstrably like a poem in this version. All right, so there's Dylan. Okay, now let's. I want to just say a few words about these Beat poet examples here. I think they wanted to be musicians. Dylan might really have wanted to be a poet, but I think the Beat poets really wanted to be musicians. And you'll see by the examples that I've chosen what I'm talking about. How many of you are familiar with Felonious Monk? Terrific. This Straight No Chaser is the name of one of Monk's most famous songs. You'll be right in tune with this, okay? So this is Amira Baraka.
Bang, bang, outishly. For Monk. Boom, 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 boom. Boom, 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 boom. Tinkle, as ifs, ands, three-toed musical afternoon dreams, midnight visions. Boom, 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 boom. These are Kate players cooking, blue glass cookers funking. Edgewise questions inside the answers. Chunks there Edgewise bluedom near boil, funk tree landscape tinkle brood as answered questions, cardboard piano orchestras singing as if the hit parade was interplanetary. Boom, 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 boom. We see, he say. Lurks, notes on shoeshine boxes, sideways dudes with big musical fingers, quiet, screaming, hooded holy rollers, preacher space, rocket church, nutty logic, straight, no chaser.
So, we got a bit of a different approach here. The tone of this would be reverential, I should think, wouldn't you say? I mean, if we had a chance, I'd be sort of engaging with the audience a little bit more on this. But let's just say, for the sake of brevity and the time that we have, I would say it's kind of reverential, kind of loving, kind of longing, respectful of the music. Its form is, pretty much free verse, one could say. No attempt at rhyming or anything like that. And, it's a poem of its time. A poem of its time. Let's move on.
In my medicine cabinet, the winter fly has died of old age. Well, here I am, 2 p.m. What day is it? The tree looks like a dog barking at heaven. Prayer beads on the holy book. My knees are cold. In the morning frost, the cats step slowly. No telegram today, only more leaves fell. The castle of the Gandharvas is full of aging young couples.
So when I think of poetry and music together, this is more of what I sort of have in my mind with it. You've got sort of a call and response. It is said that after this recording session with Al Cohn, Kerouac got heavily into his cups and he wept because he thought that Al Cohn had so much better, had done it so much better, had hit the mark. And he thought that his advantage was the fact that he did not have to use language. In other words, language is a barrier to that touching the soul. There may be that, and there may be some truth in that. I also think of the collaboration between our very own Ben Boone and Phil Levine as well. So, the interesting tone is here's playful tone. The tone is, and it's a short form, right? It's the haiku. You notice it's not the 5/7/5 traditional. So yeah. Now let's move on, and we'll do these examples.
April Fool birthday poem for Grandpa.
Diane Primo.
Today is your birthday, and I have tried writing these things before. But now, in the gathering madness, I want to thank you for telling me what to expect, for pulling no punches back there in that scrubbed Bronx parlor. Thank you for honestly weeping in time to innumerable, heartbreaking Italian operas, for pulling my hair when I pulled the leaves off the trees, so I'd know how it feels. We are involved in it now. Revolution up to our knees, and the tide is rising. I embrace strangers on the street, filled with their love and mine. The love you told us had to come or we die. Told them all in that Bronx park. Me listening in spring Bronx dusk, breathing stars. So glorious to me, your white hair, your height, your fierce blue eyes, rare among Italians. I stood a ways off, looking up at you. My grandpa, people listened to. I stand a ways off listening as I pour out soup. Young men with light in their faces at my table, talking love, talking revolution, which is love, spelled backwards. How you would love us all, would thunder your anarchist wisdom at us, would thunder Dante and Giordano Bruno, orderly men, bent to your ends. Well, I want you to know we do it for you and your ilk, for Carlo Tresca, for Sacco and Vanzetti, without knowing it or thinking about it, as we do it for Aubrey Beardsley, Oscar Wilde. All streetlights shall be purple. Do it for Trotsky and Shelley and big dumb Kropotkin, Eisenstein's strike people, Jean Cocteau's ennui. We do it for the stars over the Bronx, that they may look on earth and not be ashamed.
One of the interesting things about this poem when you think of Dylan's music is just how detailed it is. How absolutely, for lack of a better word, educated this poem is. All these political, artistic allusions, which were not only important to her family, Diane de Primo's family, obviously their grandfather, but also at a certain time to many Americans, to many people. I mean, Trotsky, everybody knew who Trotsky was, you know, and so on and so forth. You won't sort of find that depth of allusion. It's true, I think, in most of Dylan's music. Yeah, and I think one of the things you could say.
America, I've given you all, and now I'm nothing. America, $2.27, January 17th, 1956. America, I can't stand my own mind. America, when will we end the human war? Go fuck yourself with your atom bomb. I don't feel good, don't bother me. I won't write my poem until I'm in my right mind. When will you be angelic? When will you take off your clothes? When will you look at yourself through the grave? When will you be worthy of your million Christs? America, why are your libraries full of tears? America, when will you send your eggs to India? I'm sick of your insane demands. When will you reinvent the heart? When will you manufacture lambs? When will your cowboys reach Spangler? When will your dams release the flood of eastern tears? When will your technicians get drunk and abolish money? When will you institute religions of perception in your legislatures? When can I go into the supermarket and buy what I need with my good looks? America, after all, it is you and I who are perfect, not the next world. Your machinery is too much for me. I don't want to work for a living. You made me want to be a saint. There must be some other way to settle this argument. I don't want to die young. I want to die old and unhappy. I don't mind dying so long as it's not sordid. Now, Burroughs is in Tangiers. I don't think he'll come back and is sinister. Are you being sinister, or is this some form of playing a practical joke? I'm trying to come to the point. I refuse to give up my obsession. America, stop pushing. I know what I'm doing. America, the plum blossoms are falling. America, I haven't read the newspapers for months. Every day somebody goes on trial for murder. America, I feel sentimental about the Wobblies. America, I used to be a communist when I was a kid. I'm not sorry. I smoke marijuana every chance I get. Only $2.27. I don't want to work. Maybe it's looking for the job. I can't study anymore. I'll never teach for a living. I sit in my house for days on end without going out. When I go to Chinatown, I get drunk and never get laid. My mind is made up. There's going to be trouble. You should have seen me reading Marx. The American flag is absolutely meaningless to me, still just as it was in the 30s. I won't say the Lord's Prayer. I have mystical visions and cosmic vibrations. America, I still haven't told you what you did to Uncle Max after he came over from Russia. I'm addressing you. Are you going to let your emotional life be run by Time magazine? I'm obsessed by Time magazine. I read it every week. Its cover stares at me every time I pass the corner of northwest of Sutter Street and Montgomery Street. I read it in the basement of the Berkeley Public Library. Time magazine is always telling me about responsibility. Businessmen are serious. Movie producers are serious. Everybody's serious but me. It occurs to me that I am America. I am talking to myself again.
You know, I think we could say the tone of this is, it's funny, but it's also serious as well. When you think about how Dylan captured a sense of tone with an audience, with such a wide audience, and then you think about the Beat poets, each successful in their own way, you still have to say Dylan was... And the great thing about Dylan was he didn't dismiss anything. He listened to all kinds of music. He practiced all different kinds of religions. He accepted everything. And I think that, to me, in my mind, that's Dylan's great gift. Not only to himself, but to his music. And if you need any further notion as to whether or not Dylan should be included in the American literary beat movement. This is the, edited by Anne Charters from Penguin. This is the seminal, or if you're female, germinal anthology of beat poets. And Dylan has three song lyrics in there, 3 poems in there. And that brings me to sort of the last bit here. This is the last slide. And I've spent years thinking about this. This is by Brad Lighthouser, who is a contemporary American poet and critic. Posterity may view ours as the century when academic American poetry found its voice and lost its audience. So when you say found its voice, I mean certainly the proliferation of MFA programs, Masters of Fine Arts programs in creative writing across the country, and we have I have to say, a very good one here. With terrifically talented students, many of some of whom are here tonight. And I think these students have been very successful in finding their voices, each his or her own way. Now, in terms of audience, it must be admitted that, probably more people went to one professional basketball game last week than went to, all the poetry readings in the United States. You know, you can Google me on that, Iris, but I don't need good luck finding it, right? But so one has to say, where did they go? Where did that audience go? Well, where did they go? You know, I think that they went to popular music. You know, they went to popular music. So, and I'm perfectly fine with this. You know, we may have a Nobel laureate Beyonce in the future. It's terrific. Right, exactly. Anyway, thanks a lot. You can applaud now.